Okay, so again, Gabriel, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
You want to start off telling a little bit about yourself, your company, and what you do?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. I just want to say thank you for inviting me to the Inventors Forum San Diego, for inviting me, and I feel honored to speak to this forum. So once again, I appreciate that. Again, my name is Gabriel Esterman, and I'm the founder of a company called Villicon Consulting. I started this consulting firm in 2012, and I've been I work for myself, so I have no other employees, but I've been working in this consulting facet for it's about 8 years now. So I graduated from the University of Michigan, and I have a BS in mechanical engineering. I've been in the engineering field for the last 28 years in some type of engineering or technical capacity or engineering management. So just working, ranging from Fortune 500 companies through small startups. So that's kind of my background, and just like Leslie mentioned, tonight's topic is contract manufacturing part 1. So I get to go first, and I understand it's a 3-part series. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So let's. I'll stop right there. Any questions from the audience? Or do we do questions at the end?
We'll do them as we go, and then we'll reserve time at the end.
Okay.
So how many of you are interested in potentially bringing your product to market, or have brought a product to market through manufacturing? So 1, 2, 3, about a handful of you. And how do you feel that process went for you? Was it a struggle? Was it difficult? Did you already have experience in that particular realm when you went down that path?
Well, I've done it several times, so it wasn't.
It was old hat to you? No sweat, no problem? Anyone else?
Plenty of issues, when you do it the first time, there's plenty of issues that you need to know.
When you do it the first time, there are plenty of issues. Absolutely. So,
I've done things that work through contract manufacturing a bunch of times, so it's kind of easy.
great. So for those of you who haven't done it, and even for those of you who have done it, there are actually a couple of aspects of it that we're going to talk about. So contract manufacturing, we're not going to read through all the slides for you. This is a lot of information. We're going to kind of get on touch points. But basically, contract manufacturing is you essentially outsourcing the manufacture of either parts, components, subcomponents, or the entire product to a third party to manufacture on your behalf. Okay? So you are going to represent at some point yourself as the prospective either direct or indirect manufacturer of that particular product. So when we look at, what a contract manufacturer is and what a contract manufacturer does and where your role and your responsibility lies, it can kind of be a staged approach. In the example that we have here, what we're really talking about is, for this particular example, you having an idea of what your product is. So step one is whether or not you've chose to patent. For those of you and for most of you, you will have patented, right? And with that patent comes claims. We're not going to get into IP discussion tonight. We're not going to get into claims discussion tonight. Otherwise, we'll never get through this particular topic. But essentially, those claims, to a large degree, outline some of what that product, that end product, will be, in effect, right? There's a lot more that goes into it after that when you actually get into the manufacturing of it. But the important thing is to understand what your product is, what its capabilities are, who it's for, what it does. So to a large degree, you need to have all of that familiarity in place. You may need to rely on other people to help you get there and to get that knowledge and understanding, but in effect, you need to know that. So one of the steps we have here is that, you providing a prospective contract manufacturer with those specifications. So what is it you want them to do? So Gabriel, my ask of you is, what are some of those things that you need to be prepared to hand off in terms of specifications as part of the expectation or checklist with working with a contract manufacturer?
Well, I think the most important thing is you have to determine which type of
Sorry.
which type of contract manufacturing are you going to go down, or which, there's basically two types. There's, as the slide shows, there's OEM, where basically you as the inventor will own the IP and all the, and the design, or the second type is ODM, where you contract the manufacturer to, you come with they own the concept through production, but they will own IP on the final product. So, I mean, the basic difference between these two is OEM you will own the IP, and ODM, the manufacturer will own IP. So that's kind of the first question you need to ask yourself: which type of model are you going to choose for for the product that you want to bring to market? So I'm going to guess, as a question or a question of the group, I'm assuming most people here are inventors and they will want to own their own IP. Is that a right assumption to make with this group?
Yes.
So we will focus then on the first one, which is the OEM model. So
Yes.
In what case you would use ODM or prefer ODM?
ODM is when you basically have a market that you want to enter, but you don't want to invest in the development of a product at the early stages. So it's the design, the concept, the proof of concept, the testing of it. You basically go to an ODM. They already have developed that product, and basically you have a market that you can sell that product under your label to that market. So that's a very, difficult, those, to me, with my experiences, that's more reserved for already established companies that do not want to invest in the whole research and development of a product. Okay?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm guessing that one of the advantages of the ODM is the manufacturer that you're having do this has done things close enough to that they may have a better way to do it than you might have.
That is correct.
Yeah, and so if it's something that you have to analyze in great detail and it's unusual, the top one would be more likely.
Yes.
Yeah, and so in some of the examples in that top part, when you look at a lot of the products that are on the market today, specifically electronic components, electronic products, a lot of that uses one or both of these models in some capacity, right? So we've got an indicator up here, an example up here of Foxconn technology. They are, a worldwide representative contract manufacturer for, worldwide Fortune 500 companies. They all go to and rely on contract manufacturing in some way, shape, or form. So it's not a new concept. It's not just for small startups. It's not for mom and pops. This is on a large global scale where contract manufacturing is used. Okay?
Can I ask a quick, where does licensing fall in that? Is it like an entirely different bucket?
It's an entirely different bucket, yes, but there are components of licensing that may help drive your decision as to which path you go down in this particular realm, right? Because you want to, if you intend to continue to maintain ownership of your intellectual property, then you want to be cautious about which route you go down. And then from a contractual standpoint, there are obligations in the contract that will then add some additional layers of protection there. We're not going to get into those particular aspects of it. That'll be at part 3 in this series discussion. So come back, stick with us this month, next month, and the month after, and you'll get that answered. That'll keep you coming. I got to keep you on a string somehow. I can't give you everything all at once. Okay? All right, so where's my little clicker? Here we go. So, are you ready for contract manufacturing? So if you've heard me speak before, this is a question I always ask you is, are you ready? Because I know a lot of you think you're ready and you're not. And so what does it take to be ready for contract manufacturing? So I'm going to let Gabriel talk about some of these particular steps in determining whether or not you're actually ready for considering contract manufacturing.
Thank you. So the question is, are you ready for contract manufacturing? So I've highlighted kind of 4 major points that I feel that should help you understand, are you ready? So the first question you have to ask yourself, do you have the monthly and annual volumes cited and understood to be able to support contract manufacturing? Because a contract manufacturer basically will lock you in to a certain number of monthly and annual volumes. And if you don't meet those monthly and annual volumes, I'm pretty sure that they're going to make you pay some type of fee for not making those monthly and annual volumes. So that's a very important question you have to ask yourself. The second point is your product and process specifications and documentation complete? Meaning, is your 3D models, 2D CAD already vetted and completed? And because that's a contract manufacturer is going to ask you for that complete package of both product and process. Typically a contract manufacturer is not in the business of inventing product specifications. They expect you to provide that as a full package to them, and that you are ready to manufacture with them. So I can't stress to you how important that second point is. The third point is product design stability, and is it fully vetted? Have you as an inventor gone through the iterations of testing and making sure that the product is stable and tested? Now, I don't know what type of products you guys are inventing at this point, but my experience is you go from prototype to alpha to beta, and even in those steps, you have several iterations of design, testing, and then redesign. So usually if you go to a contract manufacturer at a prototype stage, you're basically going to fail, from my experience. So very important step. And then the final step is the product certification and testing. So I don't know what field your products are in, but if you're in cellular or RF, you have to have FCC testing and certification. There's RoHS testing and certification, and many others. CE, depending if it's an electrical product, you have to provide that product, and an independent lab has to test that and validate that it's safe and that it's meeting the specifications that you set forth in your process specifications. So those are the 4 main questions you have to ask yourself. Are you at that stage, and are you ready to complete all this first before to go to the contract manufacturer?
Chris?
What if you're just supplying the bottle and the cap for something, and then you want to take that out and contract manufacture it? What do you need from the contents if you're just doing the packaging? What kind of specifications and testing would you have to supply for what's inside the container? Say you did aspirin.
So typically, those are components.
Aspirin tablet is what goes inside the container, but you're just interested in filling and capping containers.
Filling.
What would you need to provide just as the contract manufacturer that's filling and capping these things?
So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking if you want to go to a contract manufacturer and ask them to develop a cap and a container, right, that will be used for other purposes?
Like in my case, I invented a cap and a container, and I also have a machine that would fill it.
Okay.
Now, what do I need the supplier to tell me about what's inside? Why is that important to me? I'm just putting them in the bottle and capping them.
So you're talking about a different aspect of it. So you're talking about the fulfillment end of it. What he's talking about is specifically going to a contract manufacturer to develop or manufacture that cap and bottle, or the contents of the cap and bottle. At your point, you're basically, I believe, just the fulfillment aspect of it. You either are supplying the cap and the bottle, the container or vessel and the contents, or you're the recipient of those contents and the container from two different entities, and then putting those together and packaging them. That's a different model.
I would suggest that if you're having packaging with medicine in it, you're going to have printing, and you're going to be responsible for the accuracy of the printing and therefore of contents.
Yeah, so that's a different discussion. That's on packaging, labeling, those types of things. Look who just walked in the door back there. Hi, Bob. Yeah, so that's a different conversation. That's on package, design, labeling, those types of things. We can certainly talk to Bob about presenting on that on some other time.
Yeah, okay.
Okay? Hi, Bob. I just signed you up for a topic.
But just like I want to add, I mean, the person or the manufacturer of the medicine itself is responsible ultimately, right? For those,
I'm asking, what do
Yeah.
they have to apply? Do they need to give something to me or not? If I'm just packaging?
Well, so there may be some aspects there that aren't necessarily part of this discussion, but I'll touch on them. So if you're going to take someone else's product and put it in your container, one of the things you need to make sure is, are they an appropriate match, right? Some things should not belong in certain vessels, right? There may be contamination issues, there may be interaction issues, or whatever the case may be. So part of that, in that example, would be understanding what is going into that container, and are there going to be any issues with it, coming into contact with that.
That's a separate discussion from what you're doing here.
Correct. Okay?
Maybe one thing to answer your question is, what do you need from the supplier? Whenever you get product, there should be some certificate of conformance or certificate of authenticity or something to say that the product meets specifications, especially if it is, anything that's medical related.
Yeah.
And I mean, there more than anywhere else.
Yeah,
I think realistically, you're going to want to have the manufacturer of the pills is going to want to control the package, the filling and the marketing. I don't know how you would get in the business of packaging somebody else's medicine.
I'm already in that business.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's talk after, and let's talk with Bob, and we'll talk about trying to put a presentation topic together on that. It's a good question.
Good question, yes.
It's not for tonight, but it is a good question because, it's a different realm of, product development, getting the product to market, working with a fulfillment company, and it doesn't have to be, something as critical as medicine, right? There are a lot of things, items, liquids, solids, whatever, that go into different containers, and having some understanding of what those requirements are is important. So, yeah, good question for another topic on another day.
But typically, I mean, if there's an outsourced manufacturer that is using that equipment that you design and you're filling medicine, that's basically, you're just selling your machinery to the manufacturer of both the medicine, but then the outsourced manufacturer who's using your equipment has to meet. I'm not too familiar, I'm not in the medical side of manufacturing, but I do know that the outsourced manufacturer has to maintain a high level of documentation for every batch that they make using that equipment, and they have to archive it for, I think, for like 10 years or something along those lines. So all I know is the ultimate responsible party in your scenario is the person or the company that owns the medicine or the product itself in that example.
Yeah.
All right?
Yep. And so I want to touch on one of the bullet points here, the monthly and annual volumes, and whether or not you understand that. So when we talk about your business plan, understanding what your product is, what's the market for it, what's the consumption rate for it, this plays into that. Because if you don't know who your market is, who your buyer is, approximately what your selling point will be, how much can you sell, you certainly can't walk up to a contract manufacturer and give them any volume commitment, right? You're going to be way off base. Your numbers are not going to match, and someone is going to be sitting on a bunch of inventory and someone's going to be paying for it, and that someone is, guess who? You. Okay? So that's where that bullet point touches into a better understanding what your business plans is. So here we're going to talk a little bit about advantages of contract manufacturing. We got a couple of bullet points here. Again, we're not going to go through all of them, but the biggest thing is understanding, the economies of scale and the cost savings that you can benefit from by using a contract manufacturer. So if you look at some of the examples here, contract manufacturers in general have a broad customer base. They have flexibility, they have scalability, they have the ability to go and work with suppliers across the supply chain to buy things in bulk, in volume, in capacity, that you can then take advantage of, which overall lowers costs across the board, not just for yourself, but for all of their customers. And so for each new client that contract manufacturer brings in, they are taking advantages of that next level of economies of scale. And hopefully, if you're working with the right contract manufacturer, over time, as their capacity increases, their scalability increases, their economies of scale are realized, you should see some additional benefit from that the longer you work with them. There's some other factors that play into that too that we'll touch on. So they're reducing costs. Talk about, if you will, the particular part here is understanding the skilled labor force and personnel. So rather than you trying to come up with all of those different capabilities or workforce capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge expense, correct? So, typically, if you try to start up your own manufacturing company, the labor to produce and assemble your product and to distribute your product is quite high. So, do you really want to invest in that? So, there are plenty of contract manufacturers that have a skilled assembly workforce that have been doing it for many years and will save you time. One advantage I see in this is it can help you to time to market. So you don't have to invest in a facility and a labor force to assemble your product or component for that matter.
So we talked about a little earlier easy entry to market. And I know we're going to touch on this a little bit more in depth next month in Michelle's presentation, but we talk about barriers to market, right? Particularly in foreign markets. This generally has more to do with the ODM model, right? So if you look at large, particularly like the Japanese market, it's very hard for an American company to penetrate a foreign market. And be successful. And so a lot of times they'll rely on those established Japanese manufacturers to help them design a product under a Japanese label perhaps, and get that product to market. Correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Well said.
All right. Oh, get my little clicker here. So some of the disadvantages of contract manufacturing, we could probably spend an entire presentation on this alone, but we don't want to be alarmist, but we want to be realists. Again, while there are lots of advantages, there are as many, if not more, disadvantages to working with contract manufacturers. So here we're going to talk about a little bit of those, and what you touched on a moment ago was materials traceability, right?
Right.
Because once you get a product to market, depending on the market that you're entering, medical device, FDA, certain aspects of it, there will be traceability requirements. And so making sure that you understand that going up front and ensuring that your contract manufacturer has those traceability processes in place so that if, God forbid, there's an issue and you've got to go back and do a recall and figure out where the origin of the issue occurred, they can help you, if not, possibly even be responsible for some aspect of it. So I'm going to hand this to you, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the market conditions and what that means from a product line. Not a product line, a production line.
So let me just back up. Let me give you a few more kind of disadvantages of contract manufacturing that's not on the slide. A few points that I kind of point out is there's, once you hand it off to the contract manufacturer, there's going to be a lack of ownership by the contract manufacturer. They are not looking for their best your best interest many times. Many times they're just trying to meet their quota and their plan to manufacture your product. So, for instance, a good example is they're not looking at material shortages in the future. That's not their job. So many times your product may come to a screeching halt because they didn't foresee that this product is either going to end of life, this component was going to end of life, or there's a shortage, a factory burned down. That's making a specific component for your product. So again, they're not looking. There's kind of a lack of ownership for that. My second point is lost in translation. So most CMs are international. So English is not their first language. So communication is going to be a very big gap. You'll be spending many, many nights talking with the contract manufacturer on issues, on production, on delivery, and it's a huge time sink. So, and lots of times you think that they understand what your request is. They say yes, and they do the 180 from what you just agreed to. So again, I can't stress to you, communication gaps and lost in translation is a huge disadvantage. So keep that in mind. And kind of the final point is contract manufacturers love vanilla, meaning they do not want change. They want to make one thing and one thing only. They do. As soon as you start making changes, you're going to lose flexibility, you're going to lose lead time, and again, your production line may go down. So you have markets change, we know this, and you are sometimes forced to change your product because an inventor has competition. CMs don't like that. They don't want to make a change to the product. So I can't stress to you, vanilla is their favorite flavor. So also, kind of the final point with vanilla is your job also is to cost cut. You want to bring your cost of goods down as much as possible. So that, again, is change management that you want to implement, but the CM's not interested in that. So just keep that in mind if you want to work with a CM. Those are some of the difficulties and disadvantages that you'll have to work through and think about before engaging with the CM.
I'm sorry, so could you put in like some sort of controls in a contract with them as far as if there's shortages, you won't be responsible for certain things, or is it just because it's like a foreign country?
Some of it's out of both control. I mean, a factory burns down, for instance, but the product, your component is not available. You can't. Yeah, coronavirus is a good example.
He's experienced some project delays due to coronavirus right now. He's here with us tonight because he's not in China because of coronavirus.
I did. That's it, absolutely right. I had a trip for next month canceled. I was supposed to go next month to China. So, but another thing is components go to end of life, and you as the designer or the product owner or the inventor owns finding a solution. The CM's not going to do that for you. They're only going to say, hey, we can't get this part anymore. What do you want to do? So.
And I don't know if this is, part of this portion or you'll get to it, but if you're going to manufacture outside of the country, would you suggest getting the patent for that country as well? So say, you're going to Japan or something, you would want to file for the patent there?
Well, I'm going to answer like any lawyer would. It depends.
He's learned.
I'm not a lawyer, but I've heard that so many times. But yeah, I think it depends on what the country is and what the type of patent is. Yeah. But I'm no expert in that. Maybe you want to mention something?
But
Who's top? There you go.
similar but different is Also, you need an NDA with your subcontractor.
Right,
Right, so
right.
that they don't disclose anything and, you know, either any of your drawings, so that, and they have a system to protect your drawings and your specifications so that, you know, they don't make their way out into the world.
Okay.
And that's standard in a contract.
Yeah, I think that's where I was getting to. Probably be more of an
Yeah, so come back in February, March, April, and we're going to talk all about the contractual requirements to deal with a contract manufacturer, and we will answer those at that time. So I'm going to keep you on that string again, okay? Bait, hook, in the mouth? Huh? All right, you're hooked. Yes?
I'm not sure I quite understand, you know, certain term you're using, end to life, the components are.
End of life. So when you're developing a product, mostly, you know, something like a digital product or electrical component or something like that, those particular products, the technology sometimes with them evolves obviously over time, right? And so there's essentially a shelf life to some components, right? And so at some point, they go end of life. So when you're doing early stage, you know, product development, that's one of the things that you need to have a general understanding of is what are the various components that you're going to need, you know, what generation is it? I mean, just like with any cell phone technology, that stuff changes practically overnight, right? And so they're ordering a lot of times just enough for that particular production run that they need because they're already developing for the next, you know, the next iteration of whatever that product is. So you face a lot of that sometimes, right? And in some cases, you yourself may want to end of life a product early. Maybe you've come up with Gen 1 and through product testing or development or customer feedback or whatever, you've decided, hey, I want to do a Gen 2. I don't want to keep selling Gen 1 because I want to introduce Gen 2. So you want to end of life your product early, perhaps, or planned obsolescence. That may then change the BOM or the manufacturing process along with that. So there's some issues there that you may have to address.
Let me add something. So what I meant by that is that your product is probably going to have a mix of off-the-shelf components and parts and customized parts that you designed. So that statement was intended for your off-the-shelf parts, and those are typically a lot cheaper than you trying to design it and manufacture it or yourself. We're probably talking, because they've already made the investment, so we're talking about electronic components and some standard mechanical fasteners and some brackets and stuff. Those are typically deemed off-the-shelf components. Those go to end of life, meaning that manufacturer saying, we're not making this anymore. We have a new generation, and what you'll find is the new generation will not exactly match the previous. They'll have different specs. And so this is more critical for if your product has a PCA, a printed circuit assembly. It's very critical for those types of assemblies. So.
Yep. And then just quickly kind of touching on some of the raw material shortfalls, right? So there are a lot of things going on globally from an environmental standpoint, and, you know, sourcing of raw materials is a critical aspect of any product in product development. And so understanding what your raw materials are, where they're being sourced from, and what's the availability for ongoing what's the path to ongoing availability of those particular products becomes a critical component of understanding the manufacturing process. Let's touch on delivery delays slightly. So from a contract manufacturing standpoint, you're, again, not their only customer. So you're slotted so much time with their resources, their production line, et cetera, et cetera. And so, if something else comes along, there may be some renegotiation at some point, particularly if you're the smallest fish in their client pool. They may need to make adjustments, which may cause some delays on getting your product to market. And whether or not you have a penalty clause in the contract, if that penalty clause is essentially nothing compared to the benefit that they're going to gain from bumping you perhaps to a larger customer, sometimes it's worth it for them to pay you out or pay that penalty because they're getting a higher return from another customer, and essentially, you're screwed. That's going to result in some big delay, and you're either going to have to accept it and figure out how to work within the confines of that, or worst case scenario, go find another contract manufacturer for then which you're back at square one, which is a huge time sink delay and can be detrimental to your product, because in some cases, your product, may have a short life cycle or short lifespan, and you want to be hot on the market, or you need to get it to market fast, and these types of things can really just shut you down. Or you may not be able to realize your full potential and be able to monetize that to the degree that you initially expected. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Where do you find the right CM?
Where do you find the right CM? So Michelle's going to touch on that a little bit more next month. So now you've got a bait hook in your mouth to come back next month.
I can just tell you later.
Huh? Gonna tell you tomorrow.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know you, so it's the oxymoron in contract manufacturing is that majority of small companies work with CMs through POs, not contracts. PO is a type of contract, of course.
Yes.
But it's disadvantageous for both parties to actually set up a contract. It takes time, takes legal expense, and it brings nowhere, right? So I just wanted to ask you, based on your experience, you obviously work with a large number of companies. How common is contracts versus just straight PO with terms and conditions?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it depends on your volumes. If you are in a very high volume, we're talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands per month.
Established company.
I would say contract.
Of course, yeah.
If you want flexibility and you're only bounded by the PO, that's where you would engage with just it would be a very small volume. But I'm going to warn the group here. Asia typically does not like trying to find a small volume PO-based CM. They're very hard to find. Most CMs do not want to deal with just building 1,000 a month.
But you can also have both. I mean, I'm used to saying where you have a contract where you say this is how we're going to play together. When you have your NDA and
Absolutely.
product specifications, and POs are given out, on some regular basis, so that limits your financial exposure.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean,
Both nested underneath one.
to answer your question, I mean, if you have a contract, you will be issuing POs. I mean, there's no, that tells the CM what to build on a monthly and quarterly basis. So, but good question, though.
Come back in April.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Let me just want to say about the delivery delays too. There's just one item that I wanted to mention too about my experience with CMs is expect turnover at all levels, meaning the technical staff and at the labor force staffing. I've not yet dealt with any CM that does not have a turnover issue. And what I mean by turnover is that both the technical staff and the labor staff don't come back. And so the CM has to retrain personnel to your product. So one of the disadvantages is that your quality will suffer because of that. But typically it's because in the CM market, they're all vying for the same employees and the same technical staff, and they jump around, and you'll see this high turnover between the CMs. So just keep that in mind with delivery, because it will impact your product if you go to a CM.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're referring to Asian CMs or Mexican?
Both, yes.
Because in my experience, in Mexico, yeah, there's huge turnover, but in China, it's basically, low-level unskilled labor. Sometimes they don't come from holidays, from their far, countryside. But trained technical staff, those English-speaking, they usually stick there for many, many years. What's additional culture?
Yes, I agree with that, but I see from Asia as well. I've seen high turnover at some of the other CMs. I think it depends on on who it is and what size it is. I will tell you, Foxconn has a very high turnover at their technical staff level.
Oh, really?
Oh, absolutely.
Speaking of Foxconn, I just wanted to give a holler here. I actually have a relationship. You know, there is a Foxconn in Mexico right here.
Yes.
South of the border. I have a relationship with them. I actually build the product there. So if guys, anybody needs interest, I'd be happy to.
Two-part question, I think. So, their CMs in the U.S. because I'm not hearing a lot of U.S. CM talk. And then, if there are, like, what's the delta in, pricing?
So one, just to answer that, so we're going to talk next month about some of the big variances between onshore and offshore. Michelle, who unfortunately she injured herself earlier today, and so she was getting quite uncomfortable and had to leave. But, she is a well-known promoter of onshore manufacturing and what it takes to manufacture in the U.S. She has deep-rooted connections with manufacturers here in the United States. Next month's presentation is going to be largely focused on that. But yeah, there's a big delta between working with the U.S. manufacturer versus an offshore manufacturer. Pricing plays into that considerably because of largely U.S. labor laws.
Did you write a book on this subject?
Michelle has several books on this subject. Gosh, if you had just asked that question 2 minutes earlier, before she limped out the door. But yes, Michelle has written articles for Huffington Post, in Inventors Digest, I believe it is. And yeah, she has several books on this particular topic, so I would look her up and get a book. I'm sure she'll have some available next month when she's here. Did that answer that part of the question?
It did.
Okay. You had a two-part, or did I get both?
Well, that was both.
Okay, I don't remember, sorry. Okay, so we're going to jump kind of now into kind of a checklist. And again, you've got a handout. It is not one size fits all. These are not all the questions that you need to ask a CM. The questions or the checklist is quite intensive, and of course it varies depending on the product that you're asking to be manufactured. So what we try to do is just give you some, high level, tips and tricks and tidbits and snippets of information that you can use to begin your kind of contract manufacturing mindset process, right? So these are some of the high-level things that, you need to think about as you start to think about choosing that path to go down the contract manufacturing route. And so here we've started to kind of just bucket what some of these questions are. We're going to go into maybe even answering a couple of these questions for you and why they're on here. So some of these we may have touched on already in some capacity with the Q&A. If we talk about capabilities, it's really important to understand when you're looking at a contract manufacturer is to understand what are the services that they provide and what are the capabilities of those services. You have to make sure that you're working with someone within the realm of what it is that you're doing. You're not going to go to someone who's producing a part or a service or a product in an industry that's completely outside of the realm of what it is that you want to do. The learning curve would just be far too great, and you're setting yourself up for a tremendous amount of pitfalls. Okay? Pardon?
That's not always the case. People add a simple things get a simple disadvantage.
But there are limitations to that, and you got to realize what it is.
Don't trap yourself in that thinking that the only guys that can build your product are somebody that's built something that
it doesn't have to be an apples to apples match, but you don't want to go, apples to bananas. Apples to oranges are even similar enough in that realm. We're talking about going completely outside your realm where the learning curve and or the processes, manufacturing lines, whatever the case may be, are far too cost intensive, labor intensive, capital intensive, both for you and them, because
don't trap yourself.
Right, because they're not going to be the ones to make that investment solely on your behalf, particularly if you're the first and only client.
Yeah, a good example, I think what she's trying to make the point of is like, say your product's cellular, you're not going to go to like a computer-based manufacturer that does laptops. You want to try to find somebody that has some cellular experience and has built a board and that product in the past. 'Cause-
Yeah, my point is, somebody that builds bicycles could build children's toys.
Oh, absolutely, yes. From a mechanical standpoint, absolutely. I agree with you on that. Mechanical's a little easier to deal with. It's when I think it's when you get to the electrical, you definitely want to leverage, if my product had some cellular RF, I know I'm going to be looking at a CM that has RF and cellular experience. So.
Yep. Okay, so we touched on actually 2 of those bullet points there. Was there another question? Oh, okay.
Okay.
So we touched on this just a little bit earlier, personnel, and while you can't expect that, just like in any company, that the person is going to be employed there for life or going to be assigned to a project for life, people move on for various reasons. But from the onset of your project, during that initial ramp-up phase, you want to have some assurance to the best degree that you can that you're going to have some dedicated support from that contract manufacturer during that initial critical stage. You can't be going through one project manager every other month, because then that's not going to keep the momentum going. That's not going to keep your project on task. So some of the key personnel, those critical folks that it's going to take to get you going, to get things moving along, again, you want to the best of your ability, kind of confine them via the contract to being as dedicated as possible. Again, that's not going to prevent someone from leaving a company or getting a promotion or whatever the case may be, but you want to try to get some assurance or guarantee that if you can, and making sure that they have the right skill sets, the right qualifications, they understand what it is they're doing. A lot of it doesn't take a large, highly skilled workforce to do some of the assembly and post-assembly stuff, or even some assembly stuff, but there are areas where having the specific skills and qualifications from some team members is important, and you want to make sure that you have an understanding that you're on the same level. Let's see, who will be responsible, understanding what that is, the oversight. So those are some of just kind of the general things, and he touched on that and how that can impact the delays when there is a high level of turnover. Equipment and technology. So, I started to touch on this just a little bit, but, when we talk about a contract manufacturer, one of the things that you're looking for, again, is what are their, when you go and do a site visit, understanding who they are, what they do, you want to understand, what is the equipment that they're working with. Is this all old stuff? Is it held together with duct tape? And rubber bands, how often are they investing in whatever the new technology is or the systems and tools that may be needed to coincide with the product that's being developed. Some cases, it doesn't take a lot. In other cases, like we talked about high technology cases, it does require investment. So you kind of want to understand what their investment levels in. Just like in any other situation, someone's always going to ask, well, how much do you invest in R&D? Investing from a manufacturer's standpoint, investing in their tools, their capital tools, their process, their equipment is important as well. So if you want to touch on that a little bit, some advantages or disadvantages when they don't have the right systems and tools in place.
Right. I mean, I think one of the biggest questions you need to ask is, when you approach a CM, is how much automation versus manual processes do you want in that? And because those are 2 totally different cost structures. So automation is huge investment, and it's typically a lot higher in cost. Manual processes are cheaper, requires more labor, but it depends on, again, I'm going to stress to you, what are your monthly volumes and annual volumes? That'll also help you determine what type of processes and equipment you're going to be using and technology for your product. So that's really what I feel is very critical for equipment and technology. Yes, sir.
I have a couple of comments. Is it okay if I share?
No, go ahead.
So on the previous slide, on people. So one thing you said, I also had those late night calls with them, and I've realized that the best way to communicate is actually written communication.
Yes.
It gives you traceability, it gives you commitment, and if a new project manager comes in, they can actually review the documentation. So the best way to communicate is PowerPoint, pictures, and videos.
Absolutely.
Always ask for videos. So that's one. Second is about personality. Key is, of course, project manager, but there's QA, so that's what's missing here. And for quality assurance, you want to make sure that they have their own processes, so you want to ask them how they do it, but you also want to hire somebody like, I know a guy who lives in Hong Kong. He's for hire. He charges only $200 per day plus travel expenses. If he goes, he speaks obviously native Chinese, and he can do much better job than you do. Also, site check. I thought I'm a pretty smart guy. Experienced a lot. It didn't tell me anything. I go to do a site check. So I look at people, look at the equipment. I don't know how to compare it. So sometimes it's best if you send somebody who actually is an expert in it, right? You hire somebody independent, and you just send them to do a site check for you. It's much less expensive, and it's actually you'll be better off. And of course, references. When you pick these suppliers, you wanna ask them for references.
You're jumping ahead on my slides, man. Next time.
No, those are great, those are great points. I totally agree.
I just wanted to.
I'm just giving you a hard time. Yeah, so totally agree with what you said, and even when you're having those late night phone calls, just like in any other business situation, if it's a critical conversation and you need to be certain you understand the words that came out of my mouth, follow them up with an email. Follow up in an email.
Yeah.
I want to be clear, per our conversation last night, this is what we discussed. If there's anything in here that is not true or you did not understand, please let me know
Exactly.
right away. Put a deadline. And then if you need to follow up, a lot of times, I don't like doing it myself either. We're all adults and we expect that if there's a problem, you let me know. Silence is golden, right? Not always the case. If you have any gut feeling or some level of uncertainty as to whether or not they really got it, follow up again and say, can you just affirm in writing that you agree or you understand or you will meet this date or we will do this. And do that. It'll give you some leverage, provided something goes wrong, but at least you have some assurance that, okay, I can sleep tonight, they got it, now let's hope for the best.
Yeah,
right?
also when you frame a question, make sure that the answer is not yes or no, because they never say no to you. Seriously.
No, it's true.
I don't speak Chinese, but I hear that, and there are 2 Chinese languages over there, right? But I hear that
Yeah.
they just don't have the word no.
Yeah, and to speak to your other point, I think you've got familiarity with this,
Yes,
is having someone embedded there in some way, shape, or form on your behalf who not only has that expertise, but maybe can bridge that communication gap. Maybe they're an English and foreign speaker. They can be there, they can facilitate, they can be your translator, they can be there if any problems or issues do come up. Those are always helpful and beneficial. I think you've dealt with that quite a bit.
Yes. We've, at least in my past experience, we've invested in having, they can't be a direct employee. Some of the countries have laws against that, but they could be a contractor for you, and you pay them that way. So definitely having someone who speaks the native language is very critical in terms of helping you determine, issue and troubleshooting and understanding where your issues are. Because if you pick someone internationally that's 15 hours away, you won't know the problem until 24 hours later. Then you have to respond. Another 24 hours has passed. So 48 hours, your line may be down. So it's not a bad investment to subcontract a local who knows the language. So can't stress to you how that's an important aspect. Yes, sir.
Say something. A lot of stuff, you're talking about it's all overseas. I think a lot of things, if anybody invents things, think about inventing something that can be made here, not overseas.
Yep.
And most of my customers I deal with, nothing is going overseas anymore. They're doing everything back here in the US.
So Bob's comment is, a lot of the discussion we're having tonight is focused on foreign contract manufacturers. We're doing that partly for two reasons. One is next month, Michelle's topic is going to be largely focused on manufacturing in the United States, right? That's her passion and that's her focus and area of expertise. She does do foreign, but she stresses doing U.S. manufacturing. But a lot of the things that we talk about are applicable also to contract manufacturing here in the U.S. You may not have some of the language barriers, you may have some of the communication issues, but largely some of the same things, can happen when you're dealing with a U.S. manufacturer, an onshore, right? Yeah, so we will focus on that, and yes, of course, as you're going down the path to getting a product to market, wherever and whenever you can, the mantra, particularly of these difficult times, is to try to manufacture in the United States for various reasons. I guess I can skip ahead for a moment, but right now tariffs are playing a big part in how and where products are being manufactured and produced. And Gabriel can speak to this a little bit. Even in China, things are moving away from China to other countries for various reasons, right? And some of those are even being brought back here to the U.S. So your point is well taken. And Michelle would...
I would also say, don't be afraid to invent upscale. No rebates on Ferraris.
What was that last part?
Don't be afraid to design something that you think is going to be expensive. There are people that have money, there are people that will buy an expensive product if it has value.
Yeah.
Everything doesn't have to be $20 at Walmart.
Correct.
$19.99.
That's what I'm talking about. You got to get out of that mindset.
Absolutely.
Because that's where all the competition is.
Absolutely.
You're trying to do a $20 product, everybody's doing a $20 product.
$19.99.
That sells for $300, you're gonna have a lot less competition.
Absolutely.
You're not gonna have to sell near as many of them.
Yeah.
So I think inventors always, I've worked with 300 inventors, and they're all trying to do something for 20 bucks. And that, the whole world does not cost $20.
Yeah. But that goes back to understanding your market, your customer base.
And to your point, my point is that the more expensive products are the products that can be built in the United States, because the labor isn't that much of the cost.
Right. But there are ways to manufacture at a lower cost, at high scale here in the U.S. But again, a lot of it comes down to understanding the market, the customer base, the market research, doing all of that up front to really understanding the interest of your product. Then you establish a prospective price point before you go into contract manufacturing, right? Because if you've done your homework and the market dictates, the majority of people...
The problem is a lot of inventors haven't done their homework.
Exactly. A lot of inventors don't do their homework.
And they say, I can't sell this for more than $30.
Right. A lot of inventors don't do their homework in a lot of different areas, not just that. Yeah, you can't presume everything has to hit a specific price point.
Don't go from the price backwards. It doesn't work.
So if you've done the homework, if you've done the research, you will have a price range that is suitable for your particular product, right? There are instances where you can go outside of that, even where you believe the market demand may need to shift or change accordingly. You can certainly, change your path. But you've got to understand where that is, because then that's also going to play a factor in how you manufacture, where you manufacture, how you market, how you promote, where you sell it. It drives a lot of aspects of getting your product to commercialization, not just where you manufacture it, okay? How you promote it, who you promote it through, all of those things. We talk about markets and shelf space, whether that's online or through a distribution or in a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 retail brick and mortar channel. All of those play into that price point factor. So let's not have one thing drive it. And certainly this discussion plays a big piece of it, but it's not the only driver. We talked about equipment and technology, investments. Some of this stuff will also play into, again, going back to recalls, if, equipment's not being maintained, if maybe there's some level of contamination that occurred because of that. We talk about, you still hear stories about lead in some products and how that affects people. So, that if the manufacturing lines are supposed to be clean lines or things like that, and there's some sort of contamination, maybe from a product that ran on the line before that, those are all things that need to be considered, right?
Absolutely.
Which plays into regulatory insight as well, right? So some products require some sort of regulatory insight, and he touched on that a little bit. We talked about certification. And a lot of that you as, the product owner are responsible for as well. The site that you choose to help with the product manufacturer may need to adhere to some of these things, particularly in a medical realm or an FDA FDA-regulated product. You may have to have your CM may have to adhere to certain guidelines when they're manufacturing the product, and so you need to understand what those are and making sure that they have, the certifications, the qualifications that adhere to that. We talk about ethical stance, right? So, wherever you're manufacturing your product, a lot of things that you personally, from an ethical perspective, how you want your company to come across to your customers, and how much these things play a factor in how you promote your business and your brand. A lot of companies, consider the environmental impact, the human health and safety, right? So, if word gets out that, child labor is being used, if, there's unsafe working conditions and people are getting sick, those types of things, if word gets out that Acme Manufacturing Company that produces products for Joe Blow and blah, 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 and blah, 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 it's not Acme Manufacturing Company that's really suffering from the bad press. It's the products and the companies that they produce those products for that are going to get hit hardest, right? You've heard those headlines over years and years and years, and you just can't get away from that. So you have to make sure that wherever you're manufacturing and whoever you're manufacturing with, that there's some synergy there, that their practices match what it is that your brand and your messaging is. Because if you're out there promoting that you're environmentally conscious brand and something happens and there's an environmental impact, you're going to suffer and you may not recover. You may not recover. And in compliance with any other certain other laws or regulations. What kind of laws, regulations have you had to deal with?
Well, it depends on where you're going to sell your product. So does everyone know where they want to sell their product? Because each Europe, Asia, South America, and North America all have different laws and regulations. So you'll have to understand that. I think Rojas is one of the biggest one right now.
I can remember when that launched. That was a nightmare.
So Europe is probably one of the toughest markets there. So just you got to think about all these certifications and.
Any questions on that? Yes.
Not on that, but kind of in general. I have a couple friends who produce soft goods, like backpacks and wallets and stuff, and they both use the same supply chain management company, which is enticing for someone like me who this is all pretty new to me, and there's so much to keep track of. You got QA and so many pieces. Do you guys recommend using a company like that, or would you recommend just figuring it out and doing it, interfacing straight with the manufacturers?
Well, I mean, it depends on what your knowledge base is on that, and are you willing to invest in understanding what and whatnot. It's either way. I mean, it sounds like if they've already have a good understanding of what the supply chain is, and I would investigate that, and because that might be your best bet in terms of trying to understand, without you understanding what that supply chain is, and that's again, it really depends. It depends on what your product is and how is it different from your friend's product. I think that has to do a lot with it. I'm sorry, I probably didn't answer it very clearly,
How
but
much are they paying to this company? 20%? So that, if you're cost sensitive, then it's an issue for you. If you know, then it's much faster problem.
All right. So processes, we touched on this a little bit earlier, having well-defined processes, certification, so we're not going to go to that too much more. But location and subcontractors is also key. Because the funny thing about manufacturing and really any part of the commercialization of a product, there's always another level to consider and think about. Even in licensing, there's, the licensee, and then there's prospective sub-licensees. We're not going to get into that conversation tonight. Go look on YouTube and see my discussions on that. But, when it comes to contract manufacturing, there's also that issue to consider, and making sure that no other pieces or parts of that manufacturing process are then further being subbed out. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, typically, they must get your approval to do that, to sub out any portion of your product. I would highly recommend that. You're going to cover that in 2 months' time, but that's part of typically your service agreement with the contract manufacturer, that you have a clause in that where they have to provide you in writing, and you as the owner or the company owns that approval process of subcontracting. Typically, my experience in this is you don't allow it. Now, lots of times you can't control it because you're not there, so that's where audits have to occur. Either you hire someone to do it, like we just talked about, or you as an entity go there and audit that and make sure that you understand the full supply chain of the contract manufacturer for your product. So that's how I would address that.
Yeah. So we touched on a little bit earlier as well, so site visits. Before you get started, during the whole time that you're partnering with them, it doesn't hurt you to arrange for periodic site visits to make sure things are going well, to make sure things are on task. Because even when things are going great, all of that is great, but you still want to make sure that you're keeping tabs. And you're looking for potential, pitfalls or things that may happen, and you're kind of documenting that as you go. Hopefully you're heading off issues or problems during those site visits, but more importantly, you're reestablishing that relationship and keeping that connection so that, hopefully, you're mitigating communication issues or foreseeing any problems that might come up, but it certainly doesn't hurt to ensure that you have that built in as well. Again, we'll talk about that in April, and what audits in general can, and how they can benefit you overall in the process. And then financial stability. Again, you want to make sure that you're dealing with a contract manufacturer that's financially stable, that has the capacity to be able to source materials, right? So I'm aware specifically of a case where a client was having a product manufactured. They had one sole source manufacturer. There was no plan B. That manufacturer ran into some financial instability. They were not able to source the parts that they needed. Basically, they not only screwed that customer, but many, many of their other customers. And then you got to figure out what to do. What's the plan? How are they going to get those sourced? When are they going to have that stability? You certainly don't want to be the one to have to invest in them. But then you got to figure out what that means to you, and what's the long-term implication of this financial issue. Is it something they're going to be able to recover from? Is it a one-time bump? Is it a bump in the road, or is this something that they're not going to recover from? And what are you going to do to kind of maneuver through that? All while that's happening, you and your product are suffering. And again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, is the whole idea of getting a product to manufacture is to monetize your intellectual property and monetize your product. And any of these things that cause delays or hiccups or problems are delaying that opportunity. And, you just see that opportunity, just dwindle and dwindle and dwindle, and you don't want that to happen, okay? Capacity, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, and product support, client support. Do you want to go into more in-depth discussion a little bit about capacity, what it means, and, your load times on a particular line? Oop, sorry there.
Sure, let's see, this was, yeah, so typically a CM, you get assigned a team of what we just discussed before. What is their capacity of the lines that many times you're going to find that you're going to be sharing a line with other products because your product may not be that customized to where it warrants its own specialized or customized line. So a good example is PC, like I mentioned before, printed circuit board assemblies are shared. So does the CM have the capacity to add your product to their current capacity and equipment set? So that's something you have to take a look at. Any specialized processes that you may have, you definitely want to get that to them, and you have to ask yourself, are they going to duplicate that, or are you going to provide that and consign that equipment to them? So those are some of the questions you have to think about in terms of capacity. And as you grow as a company, or as the product gets acceptance in the market, can the CM accept this growth and duplicate these processes on a timely basis? So those are some of the questions that you need to ask yourself. Is the CM capable of doing that, and can they grow with me? And so those are some of the questions that you need to ask yourself, and propose those to the CM themselves.
So one of the I guess issues you would love to have is you get a product to commercialization and it just explodes. And now it's in extraordinary demand, and you've got back orders for days and days. You're going to have to go back to your contract manufacturer and say, what can I do? I just got pre-orders or back orders for, 100,000 units. You've only got a line that you established for 5,000 a month. How are they going to scale? How are they going to grow? What are they going to do? How are you going to adjust? What's going to happen to all these back orders that you've got sitting there? The customer's going to cancel their orders. Freak out, right? It's a nice problem to have, but it's something you kind of need to plan for, particularly in this day and age with the internet and influencers, and you just don't know what's going to go viral, and you just don't know what's going to blow up. Again, it'd be a great problem, and I hope every single one of you have it. But, to the best that you can adjust and plan for it, it's a good idea to think ahead. Think success, and think about how your CM can scale and manage to your success. Okay? Let's see. Yeah.
Question.
One thing was missing here is MOQ, right? So you want to always start from asking them, what's the minimum module quantity? Because some of them are a million pieces a year, some of them are 100,000, some of them are 5,000. So that's one of the things. And then I've heard about the rule of thumb that you don't want to be the largest customer for this CM, but you don't want to be the smallest customer either, right? So you want to do maybe top 30, 20% of customers for them, so you'll be important enough.
Yep, absolutely. I have no argument with what you just said. Yep. So with that said, we're going to kind of start to wrap up the conversation here. Again, this is just part one of a three-part. So be sure you come back the next 2 months and get all the other questions that you have answered that we didn't answer tonight. But if you have any other specific questions that you would like to ask now, please do so. But what we want to make sure that you do is take the time to think about, put a checklist together. There are a lot of resources. Again, we've given you just a little snippet of some things to think about. Again, you're not going to go to the internet and find contract manufacturing checklist for widget type blah. You'll find, little tips and tricks, and, you can probably get a couple of those and cobble them together and put something together. And it's certainly helpful. It will certainly be helpful for you to do that. and recommend you at least have that to start with, because going in blindly and really not understanding what it is you're doing, what questions to ask, some things that you brought up, you're going in blind, and it's blind leading the blind. And, they don't have, they may or may not have a checklist that they're going to ask you as a customer or client before they bring you on. They certainly have one, but it may not cover all the things that you necessarily might want to ask them, or that you might not want to prepare for. So, be ready, be prepared, and then make sure that you have done your homework and you have potentially even gone the route of doing an RFP, right? An RFP is a request for proposal. So you basically put a plan together, and I can do a topic on this at some point in the future if you'd like, but basically a request for proposal is what it is that you want to design, you have your specifications, you have a plan, you put a proposal out there to various CMs, and you have them respond. So you get them vying or bidding for your business, and you take that as an opportunity to vet them out, you score them, you weigh them out, you do your site visits, you do what you need to do, and then you narrow down to one or two that you really get serious and you talk with, and then from there you pick one. But we can talk about that process, maybe when I do the contract discussion in 2 months. But, make sure that you do your homework, you check out more than one, wherever it is, foreign or domestic, maybe even both. It certainly wouldn't hurt you to consider maybe even weighing the costs of working with a nearshore contract manufacturer versus an offshore at the same time, so you really understand the advantages and disadvantages to both as you go through that process. So, any other questions you'd like to ask, Brett?
Yeah, I know that China does a lot of electronics. In Mexico, what type of product would you have? Contact a contract manufacturer in Mexico. What do they do down there in Mexico?
Well, I think they both regions do any type of product.
They can do both.
Yes, my experience has been that.
In particular, that Mexico focuses on as opposed to China.
Sonata does a lot of medical products,
Oh,
like
do they?
implantable defibrillators and things like that.
Okay.
In fact, Boston Scientific, which is what I have, it's all made in Ensenada.
Ensenada.
Not in the U.S.
Want to talk about where you've done CMs?
Yeah. I've worked in both Mexico, worked with Mexican CMs and Asian CMs. Mexico, typically, I have not seen anything that they have not been able to manufacture, both mechanically and electrical components and PCBAs. So,
Is China just cheaper labor then? Is that the reason China's so big compared to Mexico? Because Mexico's right here.
right, yeah. I would say that maybe 5-10 years ago, I think China's gone up in cost, both in labor and whatnot. So I've seen a lot of business leave China and actually go to Mexico in the last few years. So it does. I know a lot of companies and inventors, cost is the bottom line, and that's what you want to evaluate. And that's because I know you're just starting out and you only have a certain amount of budget just to start out with. So. But I will say that Mexico and China, there's not much difference in cost today. And obviously the tariffs is making Mexico much more attractive than China in this point in time. But who knows what's going to happen next year or the year after. Will the tariffs be dropped? I don't know. So, good question.
Shipping from China, a big factor compared to Mexico?
Yeah, shipping would be a little more expensive. My experience has been that they put them in containers and put them on the ocean. That usually reduces the cost, but you have to fill that pipeline because shipping containers take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks to get to your market if you're shipping from Asia to North America.
Right. And you have to be working with someone who is throughout that shipping channel is filling a container, because a container is not going to ship when it's not full, right? So, and one CM isn't filling an entire container usually, right? So they're working, with whatever shipping industry that they're working within to fill that container before it goes anywhere.
Yeah, that's trivial these days.
Yeah, it's just,
It's not about
it's usually a freight forwarder that they'll,
That's what I'm speaking about.
a freight forwarder will fill, you don't, typically just a couple, it'll sit at the dock a couple days before they fill the container, because they're taking all sorts of products. Yes,
I would add that you need to design a product for manufacturability before you go to a contract manufacturer. Because they don't normally take anything into account. They're gonna build whatever you give them.
absolutely.
So it's really your responsibility to make sure that it's a manufacturable product, how it's gonna be manufactured at the lowest cost. You don't just give them your product and say, build this, because they'll build it.
I can help you with that.
And if it wasn't the way to build it, you're gonna take the cost.
It's kind of true and also not true, because what happens is, if you're, for example, doing plastic, if you're doing tooling, they do DFM for you when they build the tool, right? So if you kill yourself here, if you have good quality.
But you want.
I think he's saying DFA.
Can be injection molded.
No, I'm just giving you one example. Yeah, of course. Overall, if you're thinking about assembly and pieces and all that, you need to think.
Yeah, that's.
But you can actually run it by them early on, get their feedback, and then go do some thinking
Yeah,
before
but
you engage.
sometimes they'll change your design because that's the only capability they have.
That's true, yeah.
I've run into that with one of the products that we designed for a person that does this. And I told him that the center is an extruded piece and the end caps are injection molded. And the manufacturer said, no, you can't extrude the center piece. It wasn't that you can't, it's that they can't.
Yeah.
So he ended up spending a lot more for his tooling than he should.
So,
That's definitely one of the pitfalls. You have to, you really have to vet that CM out and see what their capabilities are before committing, so.
Make sure you designed it to be manufactured.
yeah.
3D printing is sometimes a devil's advocate here, because a lot of things can be 3D printed, they can't be manufactured anymore. So you can't, just because you made one doesn't mean that it's going to be a viable product. You may have to make some serious changes to make it manufactured.
Agreed.
Someone I'm sure has 3D drawn, maybe even 3D printed something that flies that we can't fly yet, right? Just because we dream it doesn't mean it can happen. We like to think so, but there are limitations.
3D printing is what a lot of the engineers that are just getting out of college are familiar with. So I worked at a company called Carl Stores, and one of the junior engineers 3D printed something, and then we had a discussion about whether or not we wanted to make that a product. So I asked him, how would you manufacture it? And he said, well, I 3D printed it. I said, that's not the question. 5,000 of those.
Yeah.
So that can be a problem.
Yeah. So, any other questions, comments? Yes.
So Jim, how does someone pay you? Like, how do you make your money?
Well, I'm kind of a it's really just time. So you would utilize me, I'd give you depending on what the project is or what the needs were, we would sit down. Maybe you would provide me a scope of work if you're that far along, and I could help you along that lines, and then I would provide you a proposal back with my time, and that's typically how and if there are some development prototypes that you want done here, then materials, I would give you a material quote as well.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, great lively discussion. I appreciate all the, not only questions that were directed to us up here, but the interaction that was going on within the group. There's a lot of valuable expertise, in this group. A lot of people have been through the process, have struggled through it, have come out on the other side, and so that's one of the great things about this group, is you come here and you learn from a lot of people who are here. And that's what we want to make sure that you do as part of the networking, as getting to know each other, as relying on each other, relying on each other's expertise and struggles and successes. And so I thank you all for contributing to tonight's conversation, and that was great, and please continue to do that in all of our topics. So, Gabriel, thank you for coming tonight and presenting. If you all would like to speak with Gabriel after, you're more than welcome. He'll give you his card. Sydney, thank you for tonight. So, we've wrapped up on the topic specifically. David touched on